Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another Art of Procurement Friday show. So when I talk to companies about how they can assess the health of outsourced engagements, I often cite 14 different areas that they should consider. As I was thinking about topics today, I looked at those 14 areas and realized that they can pretty much apply to any supplier engagement or any supplier contract. So what I wanted to do today is that I thought I would share what those 14 different questions are so that you can use them to consider the health of any supplier engagement or contract that you're managing as you start looking to the future and kind of assessing the probability that it's going to meet the original business case. Before I go into the show today, I do want to remind you that I recently published the report called 21 Tips to help you secure your dream procurement job. The report is a summary of tips and tricks. They cover the entire job search process. I built the report based on recent Art of Procurement interviews with experts in the procurement recruitment field. I'm excited that it's been a great hit so far. So if you'd like to go and download the report, if you haven't done already, you can find it at artofprocurement.com/21tips. Okay, well, let's go into the content for today's Friday show. So when I first built out the framework, as I mentioned, it was really in the context of helping companies assess, and really when they were mid-contract, what the probability was that their contract would meet its original business case, and whether any changes would be needed between now and the end of the contract. Each one of the categories or questions I'd score on a 100-point scale. I have a number of sub-questions, if you will, within each high-level question. And then I have some algorithms that then determine the likelihood that the program will either significantly exceed the business case, whether it will meet the business case by the end of the contract, or if it's a good candidate for either termination or for a restructure. The intent was really for clients to use the questions to be a bit more surgical about where to focus in terms of bringing an ROI for optimizing contracts that they have in place with service providers. So without further ado, let me go into the 14 questions. And what I do want to say, just as a caveat, is that these aren't in any particular order. The other thing I do want to say is that, you don't need to scribble all these down. I'll tell you at the end how you can get the checklist, which goes through each one of these 14 questions in more detail, because I've put them down into a quick one-pager that you can download from the Art of Procurement site. So I'll tell you about that as I go through at the end of these 14 questions. So the first question is about burning platform. So consider the burning platform that existed and was really the reason why the contract was signed in the first place. Does your company still have the same need that they do for the services that you contracted for today versus when you originally contracted? Maybe there's an even greater need, or maybe it was one of those things where there was an immediate need and 2 or 3 years down the line, you don't really need those services quite as much. It's not quite as much of an imperative as they were before. So that's one of the key areas where you consider what you think the longevity of the contract will be, whether you still have that burning platform. The second is program sponsorship. So I found that program sponsorship is really critical to maintaining the internal focus that you need for a contract to be successful. So do you still have the program sponsorship you need? If not, what's that costing you? What's interesting is if you can actually demonstrate the cost to your company of the lack of program sponsorship, for example, in how the contract isn't bringing the benefit that was expected, or if there's opportunity for more, that you really just need an extra push inside the business to help realize. The third question is to look at the performance to date. So this is quite an easy one. How has the engagement performed when compared to the original initial business case as of today's date? The next question then is to look at future performance. So based on your experiences to date, how likely is it that the service provider is going to be able to meet all future requirements of the contract? If you're not sure, or if it's not entirely clear, they have a roadmap in place to be able to kind of show you how they're going to meet the future needs of the contract. If it looks like they're not going to be able to, then obviously that's a red flag in terms of thinking about do you need to restructure or do you need to look at the scope in the contract. The fifth and sixth questions are around reputation. So number 5 is the reputation of the engagement. What's the reputation of the engagement among key business stakeholders and executives? Is it well thought of? Or does any talk of the engagement kind of bring negative connotations internally? Because that's obviously critical in how people internally see and view the engagement. And it might not actually be, the engagement may be doing really well from a results perspective, but it may still have a negative reputation. The sixth one, and still on the theme of reputation, is the reputation of your service provider. And I find it important to distinguish between the reputation of the engagement itself and that of the service provider, because it could be that the engagement is well received in terms of the outputs and performance, but perhaps nobody likes the service provider. Or on the other hand, it may be that your service provider is well liked, but for whatever reason, the engagement isn't going as planned. So it's important to look at reputation from a natural engagement perspective and also from a supplier perspective. The seventh question is compliance. So this is going to look different for different engagements. Sometimes there might not be an alternative but to use the service provider in the contract. But oftentimes there are still alternatives that exist if stakeholders want to go and do their own thing or use their own service provider. So it's important to look at if the business is actually using the contract and using the service provider as it was designed or as they should be doing. If they aren't, then obviously that's a red flag. An important category, and this is the eighth question, that I found is a bit more difficult to measure is culture. So is there a cultural fit and a strong sense of partnership that exists between you and the service provider? If there's not a great cultural fit, it really makes it difficult to build long-term, strategic, value-based relationships. It may be that the engagement is going to plan from a results perspective, but it's a lot of you just kind of butting heads against each other all the time. That signals that maybe when the contract is ended, this service provider isn't the right one for you, so now might be the time to start thinking about alternatives. The ninth question that I look at for clients is governance. So I'm a really strong proponent of governance, but having said that, not governance for governance sake. I find that when it's really executed strategically, it's a lot more than just checking the boxes of a contract. So ask yourself, do you have a governance program in place first and foremost? You may have one in the contract, but you may not be executing on it. If you have a governance program, is it measuring the right things? Is the governance meetings or are the governance meetings attended by the right level of people on both sides, or is it just lip service? Are you considering strategic direction of the program through governance and making sure that the engagement itself is aligned with where the business is going? Or are you just looking, more blinkered, I guess, with just measuring day-to-day performance? Number 10 on my list is the contract itself. Take another look at the contract, and is it really encouraging the right behaviors? Is it aligning the needs of both you and the service provider? Or did you come across some hidden gremlins that you really didn't see coming, when you first engaged with the service provider? There may be things in there that you didn't realize the consequence of. You didn't realize how big of an issue they would come when it comes to the day-to-day management of the contract. Some of those can come back and bite you and skew the contract in the service provider's favor. So when you're thinking about longevity of the contract, is it really fair? Or do you think that by making some changes and bringing more parity in the contract, that's going to be a benefit in terms of the longevity of the contract? Number 11 that I look at for clients when considering whether a contract is going to return the ROI in the original business case is personnel. So do you feel that the engagement has the right level of personnel and the quality of personnel? And that's on both sides for it to succeed. Or is the service provider putting folks on the engagement that you just don't think are able to drive the change, for example, or deliver the results that are needed under the terms of the contract? Or maybe you yourself don't have the right level of people managing it. So, that can be on both sides, both service provider side and on your side. The 12th question is to take a bit of a deep dive on financial health. So has the ownership status or the financial health of either party changed since the contract was signed? And has that had any impact on the success of the engagement? I often see this when there's a change of ownership. It may be that the previous company that you contracted with, you were both really aligned, and now you have a different, there's somebody else that came in and had a change of ownership with a service provider who has a different philosophy. And maybe that's having an impact on the performance of the contract or the likelihood that you'll extend the contract when it comes up for renewal. Another example is if service providers are experiencing financial difficulties, is this impacting their ability to provide the services at the required levels of performance? When I look at number 13, this is also of critical importance, and it's risk management. So has there been any specific risk events during the terms of the contract so far? Or are there any red flags that concern you about the supplier's ability to deliver to the contract? What are they? Think about, are they controllable? And if they happened, what's the likely impact on your business of a risk event? It could be something that it's so minor it's just not going to have any impact on the business, not even worth considering. But it could be it's a service provider who you're really dependent upon, and a risk event could have huge ramifications. Does your service provider have mitigation plans in place should there be a risk event? If they do, then obviously that's a good thing. But if they don't, then that's another red flag in terms of the health of the contract that you have in place, the health of the engagement. The final question to consider relates to fees and profitability. And I know that, as a buyer myself, that's sometimes something that I wasn't particularly concerned about. The service provider's margins. Obviously, when I just have my cost hat on, and this was more in the manufacturing space, you kind of see margins as a zero-sum game. Obviously, they're not, but that's sometimes how you see it when you're thinking about your service provider margins. But the fact is that for a service provider to actually invest in the account as you would want them to, there has to be an incentive in the contract, in their margins and their fees for them to do so. So is there a reason to believe that the service provider maybe isn't enjoying the profits that they anticipated as part of their original business case? Are you putting high expectations on them in terms of asking them to give you work free of charge that they didn't anticipate, or just making the cost of doing business with you high because of perhaps complexity within your business? Maybe there's a case where you have demanded price reductions without a commensurate change in the scope of the engagement. And that's something that I see quite often. That obviously changes the opinion that the service provider has and their ability to invest in you as a client. It really plays a big role in how the client reacts to future requests that you might have, and how much they invest in you as a client, how likely they are to use their best and brightest talent on the account. So taken together, those 14 questions really help you determine the likelihood of the contract, the engagement that you have with the supplier being a success when it comes to the end of the contract. When you start looking at these questions and you think about where they stand, and just think of it on a 1 to 10 scale for each one of those. Where do you have 1s, 2s, and 3s? Are those things that you need to address right now, and that would increase the health of the contract? Or are there so many 1s, 2s, and 3s that it becomes obvious that the writing is already on the wall for the engagement, and you either have to do something pretty quickly and pretty radically to change the scope, for example, change the personnel, whatever it takes to get things back on track, or perhaps it's clear that even now you're not going to be extending the term of the contract with that service provider, so you can start putting in place plans today to either bring that back in-house, or to begin the process of looking for alternatives. The 14 questions aren't meant to be all-inclusive, just really giving you focus to look at the initiatives that are going to have the greatest ROI in terms of optimizing the engagement. So I know that I mentioned just before I started going down the 14 that there's a lot of information here that I've kind of run through in a short period of time. So there's a couple of ways that you can just take this a little bit more at your own time. First of all, there's going to be a transcript of the show, and that's going to be at artofprocurement.com/23. That's just the typical show notes page that we have for each Art of Procurement show. However, what I would recommend is that I've put all these questions into a really handy checklist. It's just a couple of pages with each one of the 14 categories and a couple of thoughts under each category. So if you'd like to get that, you can download it by just going to artofprocurement.com/14 questions. That's artofprocurement.com, 14 questions. Pop in your email address, and I'll send you an email right back with the link of how you can download the checklist. Okay, well, thank you so much for listening in once again. I look forward to talking to you on Tuesday. I have another great interview show. All right, take care.